Are you running a marathon? Oh my god, I could never run a marathon. You sure about that? My god, a marathon is like 42 kilometers, 26 miles. I don't understand those people.
That actually used to be me. But now I have a marathon podcast and I'm running the Boston Marathon in 2 weeks. My name is Kristian Warwick. I'm a former professional speed skater. I did my first ever marathon in 2:52, and I'm here to share everything that I know about endurance sports, have guests on, and hopefully be your regular companion on your runs or workouts. Today, I have a very special guest with me. I'm very excited to have one of Norway's best triathletes on this podcast. He started his career training with Kristian Blummenfelt, and that kind of laid the foundation for his career as a triathlete. He comes from biathlon, winter sports, very different sport than triathlon, but he has a sub 8-hour Ironman under his belt. He's 1 out of 3 Norwegian athletes or triathletes qualifying for the Ironman World Championships, and Kristian Blummenfelt and Gustav Iden are the other 2. So this guy has a lot of experience, great results, and now in just a week, he's doing the Rotterdam Marathon and he's aiming at a sub 2:20. He's combining these great results and all the training that he has to put in with a full-time job on the side. I'm super excited to have Kristian Grue on this podcast, and I think that our chat about training, about his philosophy, how he's thinking about training going forward, his goals, all of these conversations or this conversation really made me more aware of what is important for me going forward. And I think that a lot of people can benefit from hearing what he's thinking. One of the most important things that I think that I got out of this conversation was to hear how he's looking at the intensity control of things, how he is focused on the hours that he's putting in, combining that with a higher intensity. But most importantly, when Kristian says high intensity, is it really what you and I would call high intensity? Oh, if you're listening to this podcast, please review it, give it some stars if you like what you're hearing. That will really help me to build this podcast into something that is bigger than just a few listeners. Thanks. Enjoy this hour-and-a-half long conversation. I really think that you'll have fun listening to Kristian. Hi, Kristian.
Hi,
Welcome.
thank you.
I was actually thinking about it when I was gonna introduce you, because like for me, I usually turn my name into like more of an English way of saying it when I'm saying so. I'm like, hey, my name is Kristian Warwick.
Yeah.
How do you say it if you're meeting international people?
I normally go with the same. I go with Christian, but
What about your last name?
my last name is worse. So then I say Grue.
Grue.
I
Okay.
think that's the best. Christian Grue. Yeah.
You are not in Norway right now, are you?
No, I'm on a Spanish island, Mallorca, training for the upcoming triathlon season. I'm preparing for my first race of the season, a marathon in Netherlands, Rotterdam Marathon.
Cool. And have you already had a workout today?
Not yet.
Not
These
yet.
days, I tend to work in the morning, and we start a bit later, and then we train through the day when the weather is it's still a bit chilly in the morning. So we normally start the first session around 9 or 10.
Because you are a triathlete and you guys are, I guess, like at least compared to a lot of other sports, you're usually up a bit earlier than the rest of us.
Yeah, normally when I'm back home, I have office time in the middle of the day, so then I usually swim from 5:30 in the morning, and in the weekdays my alarm goes off at 4:50. So now it's a bit later to bed and a bit later up in the morning, but I tend to get used to the difference quite fast.
But who are you? Like I mean, I know who you are, but if you were to introduce yourself.
I am now a 30-year-old triathlete from Norway. Uh, I was born in a small place just outside of Oslo called Kløfta. Um, lived 4 years in Lillehammer and studying there sports science. And back then I did biathlon. Started doing biathlon when I was around 15 years old and did that until I was 23. And then I went straight into triathlon in 2018 um, and had my first professional season in 2022. So now I live in Oslo, working with administration in the building and construction company called Fleet Entrepreneur. Um, and my days are basically training and working and sleeping.
Uh, How do you balance that?
Sometimes it's quite hard, but it for me being structured and having focus on nutrition, eating healthy, eating enough, sleeping enough. Of course, that's sometimes the hardest to get in enough hours of sleep. When you prioritize hard, I think you get to do what you want to do. And for me, where I am right now, work and training is what I'm prioritizing. So yeah,
And you were saying that you came from biathlon, and biathlon obviously you're doing a lot of, or it's half of it is cross country skiing, and then you're shooting on targets. What like coming from that sport going into triathlon? How was that transition?
it took a few years because for first the benefits of having a background from biathlon is that we normally train a lot of different activities in the summer. I was used to doing running. I was roller skiing in the summer. I was cycling a bit. Uh, so you have a very good variation in the training, just like in triathlon. But
Hmm.
the difference was I never did any intervals on the bike.
No.
We normally did uphill intervals when running in the summer, or we were running really slow uh, out in the woods. So getting in the speed and intensity and power on the bike, the speed on the run, that was what took the most time. And also, when coming from biathlon, you're used to a race time of 30 to 50 minutes and a more interval like race. You have these uphills where you go really hard, and then you can sit in hockey for a minute or so. But in triathlon, you just go with a steady pace for a really long time. And especially the long distance that I'm focusing on, it's a lot lower intensity, but you never have any breaks. You just go steady hard for 7.5, up to 8 hours.
And what made you make this transition? Because I mean, obviously both sports are endurance sports, but nothing. They don't have a lot in common.
That's true. It is, as you say, it's endurance sports, both of them. I've always been into endurance and I've always loved being outside and training a lot of hours. And back then, my best friend, Jürgen, was on the national team in triathlon. And we were training a lot of hours together, especially in high school. So he was the one convincing me to try triathlon when I had a lot of sickness and injuries the last 2 years of my biathlon career. So I switched right after the Norwegian national championships in 2023 and went straight into the first year in 2018 with uh, just a few triathlon races, mostly training. Uh, and then I got invited to the national triathlon team camp in Font-Romeu, where I learned a lot about how they train and their philosophy. So that's what really got me into it.
Yeah, because I think that it's also important to kind of establish that you're at a pretty high level as a triathlete right now. Like, can you say something about your results, where you are right now, and also how long did it take you to get to a decent level?
Yeah. From the start, first seasons, I was racing age group. Uh, that's where everyone can race in triathlon. I was starting in 18 to 23 age group, I think it was, um, and had my first half distance race in 2019, where I won the age group in Ironman Mallorca 70.3, and they're qualified for the 70.3 Worlds in Nice. Uh, so I had a few quite good results as an age grouper already from the start. But when I went pro in 2022, I didn't have the setting results. Of course, it's an experience extremely much higher level in the pro field. Uh, and most countries they have a qualification to be a part of the pro series and be a pro athlete. Um, so my best results as a pro, I would say I have a third place from European champs in Almere, a eighth place from European champs Ironman in Hamburg, where I also qualified for the World Championship in Nice. Uh, and that's something I'm quite proud of, being the third Norwegian in history to qualify for pro field in Ironman. Uh, and I also had two second places from Norseman. I think that's the most famous triathlon in Norway. So that's
Yeah, that's really cool. And like you said, the most famous triathlon or Ironman in Norway. That is a pretty unique one, isn't it?
yeah. It's a unique course, a unique race. I love it because normally we do races with 1 to 2 loops on the swim, uh, 3 to 4 laps on the bike, and the same on the run. But in Norseman, we take the ferry out in a fjord called Eidfjord. You jump off 4:55 in the morning, and 5 a.m. the start goes. You swim 3,800 meters uh, to transition one, and then you bike across Hardangervidda towards a place called Austbygd, 180 kilometers with I think it's around 3,500 meters of climbing. Um, and then you start to run towards Gaustatoppen. That's one of the highest mountains in Norway, where the first 25 kilometers is not just flat but rolling, and the rest is just uphill up to the top of the mountain. So it's a course where you get to see a lot of spectacular nature, and it's a race where you also have to have support. You have to bring at least one person to support you during the race, and that makes it a bit more of a team feeling to do the race.
Really cool. And you also, before we jump more into talking about your career, you mentioned that you trained with the national team and that you were the third Norwegian ever to qualify for the World Championships, right? Yeah. And I guess at least a lot of listeners who are, if they hear about Norwegian triathletes, they will hear or think of Kristian Blummenfelt and Gustav Iden. Have you also trained some with them?
Yeah. When I was in Fondrema back in 2018 or 19, um, they were there on camp together with Jürgen and Stornes. Um, and I think that was what really got me into triathlon, seeing the four of them training together, how structured there was, how disciplined there was, um, and just seeing how hard they worked towards their goals.
Yeah, because like then you're starting out your career as a as a triathlete, and you get to learn from the best in the world. Like, what did you take away from that camp or from training with them?
I think it was just to see how focused and good they were in everything. Like they were training really much. They were training really hard. Uh, they were really disciplined in everything. Like if we had scheduled to meet at 8 a.m. in the morning for a bike ride, uh, the guys left at 8 a.m. If you were there 8:01, they had already left because they had then like 3-4 hours of biking, and when they got back home, they had to eat, sleep, and then prepare for the next session of the day. So like every day was really planned, structured, and focused towards one big goal. Um, yeah, and seeing how well they did all the training with the intensity control. Normally, I think it's when you're in a group with different strengths, it's really easy to push each other. And for a lot of people, do the sessions a bit harder than usually should. But
Mhm.
on the national team, they had a really good focus on intensity control and doing the session in your intensity instead of pushing.
Is that what you feel like was the most important thing you learned?
Yeah, because I think the daily structure and the intensity control when doing so many hours of training, I think that's key to develop in this sport. Of
Mhm.
course, you can come away with less training, but especially for me, starting a bit late with triathlon, I think I had to do a lot of hours, and then it was so important to be strict on intensity control.
So how would you say that that training camp, I mean, you're already telling us like how this has influenced or what you took away from it, but how has this influenced you as an athlete? Did it change you at all coming from a winter sport that is quite different and then going into a new sport and then you go to this training camp and you train with some of the best in the world? How's this influenced you and what changed?
Yeah, of course, it had a big impact on how I did things after the training camp. Uh, of course, my friend Jürgen, he had already introduced me to a lot of the training and how they did it on the national team. Uh, and I think the biggest difference was how many sessions and how the days were structured. Because back then, when I did biathlon, it was normally it was first of all it was never more than 2 sessions a day. Some days one session, and if you had a hard session in the morning, you had like a recovery session in the evening. And going from that to having like double duels in one day, and maybe also an easy session, and training 3 times a day, it was quite different. So it meant that everything around has had to be even more specified, controlled. Yeah. So I think the biggest difference coming in was to see how they did everything, not just the training sessions, but everything around.
Cool. That's real. That's it's very interesting to hear. And I mean, after I got to know you and you told me about how you guys train, and I worked with Kristian Blummenfelt for Red Bull a few weeks ago, and he told me about the intensity control, like especially coming from speed skating, where uh, I guess speed skating, the competition time is even shorter than in biathlon, and like for at least for me, hearing about the intensity control and how different that is, not in terms of focusing on getting those easy trainings in, and obviously you guys are training more than speed skaters do, but still, I remember being shocked by how low the intensity is on, say, a threshold training, like compared to what I grew up with. So I'm very interested in hearing more about intensity control. But before we go into that, we heard who you are, what you have done. What are your goals? And I would love to hear like your long term goal, and then obviously your triathlon goal. But I also know that you have another goal coming up very soon this season, like you
Yeah,
mentioned with the marathon.
we can start with my long-term goal. My long-term goal is to be able to do triathlon full time, to compete on the highest level with the best guys in the world, uh, and qualify for the world champs, and do well in the world champs. I've, of course, I said I qualified in 2023 to the world champs in Nice. Coming into that race, I had an injury, struggling with my back, and I had to DNF from the race early on the run, and that's something I need a revenge on that pace, and I want to be up there and race against the best guys in the world and really give them a fight in every race I'm at. So that's what I'm training for long term. And a bit more short term this season, of course, qualifying for the World Champs in Nice, getting revenge on that course. I also have Norseman coming up for the first time since 2022. I've done race 3 times before. I have won 7th place and 2 second places. So people can guess what the goal is for Norseman this year.
What would that mean to you and your career? You think like if you were if you won that?
I think for me personally, it would mean a lot. It would be a really big victory. And I think, first of all, because Norseman is a course that suits better for lighter athletes, uh, with all the climbing on both bike and run. Uh, I think for me, being a quite heavy triathlete, uh, to win Norseman and show that it's not all about weight when it comes to hard and hilly courses. That would mean a lot. And also, it's a course, it's in Norway. I've done it 3 times before. Um, I've spent a lot of time training in the course, and I know it very well. So it would meant a lot to achieve my goals there this year.
Cool. Sorry, I interrupted you with your last goal that's coming up pretty soon.
Yeah, I'd say now it's 9 days to the first race of the season, which is not a triathlon race, it's a running race. I'm starting the season with Rotterdam Marathon. Uh, it's the first time racing a marathon this early in the year. I've done 3 marathons. The first was Valencia in 2023. December. Second one was Jessheim Winter Marathon uh, in November, 3 weeks before Valencia Marathon again in 2024. So that's the three pure marathons I've done outside of Ironman.
And what's your
And
PB?
2:23 is my PB.
And what did you
So
do on your first one?
2:29.
Yeah. So you did a sub 2:30 marathon on your very first marathon.
Yeah.
But I guess you've done some marathons, just
Yeah,
not by
that's true.
itself.
You have to add that I've done a lot of marathons in the Ironman races I've done.
Mhm.
And the fastest one was 2:38 in Hamburg in 23.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I've also done quite a few half marathons.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's a big difference from doing half to full marathon, and also from Ironman to pure marathon,
Mhm.
because the pace is quite much higher, and it's just a different feeling starting the race with fresh legs.
Yeah. I can't I can't even imagine. I mean, I've done the Olympic distance, and I thought starting a 10K after a little bit of swimming and a little bit of cycling was hard, and I can't imagine how it is after, yeah, the distance that you have behind you on those. Yeah. So what's your goal for the Rotterdam?
I want to go sub 220. I think that the training leading into this race have been good enough to do it. And then we'll just see how it ends up on race day. Of course, I need to have a good day. The conditions in the race needs to be good. Netherlands is famous for a lot of wind, so
Hmm.
I hope for good conditions. But
Yeah.
the sessions I've done the last month says that it's possible.
What's the course like there? I obviously it's the Netherlands, so it's gonna be flat. But is it a loop or several laps, or what is the Rotterdam
It's
like?
it's one loop, as far as I know. It's fast, but there is some turns, and there is a short gravel section there, as I've heard. But I think that the European record is still from the Rotterdam Marathon back in 21 or something.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's possible to race fast. I'm traveling there with another Norwegian that went to 20 there a few years ago, and is also
Hmm.
trying to break the 220 limit.
That's a pretty cool club to be a part of if you manage to break the sub 220.
Yeah, that would be cool. It's not too many years ago since I tried to break the 70-minute limit on the half marathon. So to be able to keep the same pace for the double distance, it would be a good start of a new triathlon season.
Yeah, for sure. How would you say that you are if you were to look at all the three disciplines that triathlon is like? What where are you the strongest?
Right now, it's the run, for sure. Normally, it's the combination of bike and run.
Hmm.
I'm not the strongest biker, but I tend to run quite good after a strong bike. Um, if you see internationally, my swim haven't been the best so far. I've had one race where I had a really good swim, being on the tail of the front pack.
Hmm.
But normally I'm a second or third back swimmer. So of course, starting late with swimming is not beneficial because it's so much technique.
Hmm.
You can be strong, you can have a good capacity, but if you don't have the right technique, it's really hard to develop in swimming. But I've taken some steps a few years, not as big as on the bike and run, but I think the combination of biking and running is strong sides.
Yeah, because I know that you have quite the capacity, and we have obviously, like, we had some bike rides together. I think like the first time we met was when I worked with you in 2019, and or maybe 2020. But I don't think I knew that you were by at that time so fresh into triathlon, because I remember seeing you on social media. We were working with some of the same brands, and I'm like, oh, this is an established triathlete, and then kind of realizing how now when you're talking about this, how recently you actually transitioned. But I'm like, based on the years of obviously biathlon, but also as a triathlete, we talked a little bit about like what you learned from the training camp with the pros, with Blummenfelt, and what would you say that your training philosophy is? Like, do you think that it's the same as the other guys? Do you have your own? What is unique about your philosophy with training? There are two things that I love doing in life, and that is running and making content. And for my content to be better, I need the right music. I've partnered up with MusicBed, and because of that, you can get a free trial of MusicBed by hitting the link down below or in the show notes. Get MusicBed today and make better videos. Back to the show.
I think, of course, going into triathlon, seeing what the national team did, and training a bit together with them, I started going with their same philosophy that you need to train a lot, and you need to have focus on intensity control. Uh, but I also think that that a training plan is never better than the adjustments you do. Uh, the first priority for me is consistency in everything I do. Uh, and to do that, I need to make adjustments according to the whole picture. Of course, now as I work a lot more than before, uh, it's not always as easy to control the whole day and to make sure that you're always ready for what's planned for the next day. So being able to make adjustments, either if it's to shorten down the session, to change the days where you have interval sessions, or whatever. I think it's what makes me able to keep the good consistency, being injury free, and developing together with quite a high workload also.
I, I've been like, when I talk to people, I've said that training for a marathon is like the easiest thing that I've ever trained for, in terms of that it feels non-complicated. And what I mean by that is that, at least for me, I need to get a lot of miles in, and most of it is easy. It's easy, low intensity, and then for me, I'm obviously not at the level you are with as many training hours right now, combining everything with work. So I only have one threshold training a week, and for me that has kind of worked very well. And I am also aware that I have the muscle memory from having been an athlete, so I probably improve quite a lot just because I'm almost moving. But in your opinion, in your philosophy, like, are would you say that you fit into the category of like almost everything is easy, and then you have a very small amount that is hard? Or will you say that you are, yeah, where are you at?
Uh, I think for some long distance athletes, I train a lot of intensity.
Hmm.
Uh, And that's because I don't get to have the huge amount of volume now as I could before. Uh, and I also think that you need a lot of intensity, uh, especially at the this time of the year coming from the winter. For me, it's more normal to have a bit lower volume and a bit more intensity. Um, because you have the indoor training in Norway. It's a
Mm-hmm.
better time to build a good capacity or build a base. Then when the spring comes, it's easier to start doing more hours because the days are lighter. It's warmer outside.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, and also it's doing them more longer and well, it's on 2 sessions. It's more specific towards race season. So during winter, I can normally have around 5 to 6 intervals a week. And during race season, it's maybe not more than 3 to 4. But then they are usually longer and it's tougher, especially for the muscles.
And to put that into context, like 5 to 6 hard trainings a week. First of all, I think that, and I'm very curious about this because at least my experience talking to triathletes is that when you say high intensity, it might not be what like your average Joe would say is high intensity. Like what is high intensity in this context?
Yeah, that's true. I think a lot of athletes they tend to go really hard when they first go hard. Uh, And I think that's easier when you're not training 20 plus hours a week because you have time to recover. But when you're doing 2 sessions today and you need to be ready for the next one, you need to control intensity. And it also needs to be more specific to what you're training for. So when I say intensity sessions, I mean from threshold to higher. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
in Norway, we use the 5 zones, heart rate zones, uh, and zone 1 and zone 2 is easy training. Zone 3 and zone 4 is more around threshold, and zone 5 is VO2 max work. So this winter, I haven't done a lot of VO2 max because we saw that last year my VO2 max was good enough for Ironman racing. So now it's been more focusing on closing the ceiling and getting my economy closer to my VO2 max and be able to work at a higher percentage for a longer time instead of raising the roof even higher.
So those high intensity workouts that you're talking about, like I, when I have conversations with people who are trying to run like their first marathon, half marathon, they tend to tell me about those workouts where they're so tired after like every session that they're throwing up, like they're on their knees, not able to like to talk or do anything. And usually my response is like, then you probably did it a little bit too hard, especially if you're training for a marathon. And like, where would you say that you are, like during or after those sessions that you're talking about?
I can't really remember the last time I had a session going all out. Uh,
Hmm.
I think that has to be the last race I did. Uh, and as you say, there was a lot of people. They tend to push way beyond what they need to do in interval sessions. And I also have some athletes I'm coaching. Uh, and my focus has been to take down the intensity they have in interval sessions a bit so that they're able to keep consistency in training
Mhm.
and train more often. Because I see a lot of athletes, they do an interval sessions if they do it on Tuesday and push so hard that they're not able to do a new session before Thursday or Friday. Um, and they have to take a rest day on Wednesday. And instead of keeping the intensity just a bit lower and being able to have maybe an easy day on Wednesday and another hard session on Thursday, if you think about the bigger picture and the longer game, I think that's much more important. And also, you can see from studies that if you're training, say, a VO2 max session, uh, pushing all out and up to close to your VO2 max doesn't give you a better benefit from the session than pushing up to, say, 90% of VO2 max.
Mhm.
The only thing you do is making the recovery time longer. So I think for a lot of age group athletes, they will benefit from taking the intensity down a bit and being able to train a bit more and a bit more often.
Yeah, I find that to be super interesting because I feel like it took me years. Obviously, my dad was my coach for years as a skater, and he was always preaching this like don't go too hard also on the high intensity workouts. And I think it took me a while to realize how right he was about that. And for me, I think it was maybe one of the last seasons as a skater how I realized how so my maximum heart rate is 190 ish, and like for me working somewhere between 150 and 160 actually just makes me so much better. I can obviously go a bit above 162, but between 150 and 160, that's where I've felt like I have constant improvement week to week. And I was just shocked because that used to be that was never my low intensity, but it was still not an intensity that I thought would really help me build that much. So
That's
yeah.
you. And of course, it depends on what you're training for. If
Yeah.
you're training for 400 to 1500 meters on the run, you would need to have some sessions where you're pushing really hard and all out.
Hmm.
But training for a marathon, you never do like 42Ks in marathon or at marathon pace. Uh, and in the race, you're never pushing close to VO2 max.
No.
So you need to make it specific to what you're training for.
I also want to ask you about and this is gonna be for the people who have a relationship to lactate, but before I ask you about like your lactate intensity on those workouts, I'm also curious. You said 5 to 6 of those high intensity workouts a week, and to put that into context in terms of like how much you actually work out during a week, how many sessions do you have in total during a week?
Between 14 and 16 normally.
Yeah, yeah. So like because what I think that when a lot of people hear this at first, regardless of like knowing that you're a professional athlete, you saying 5 to 6 hard workouts a week, it might almost like confirm to some people that oh yeah, but then I'm doing the right thing because I also do the same. But you
That's
have
you.
to then look at it this in the bigger picture of like it's still just a percentage of what you're actually doing.
Yeah, of course, if you're doing 5 sessions a week, you can't do 5 intervals a week.
No.
But I think that if you see the hours I'm doing, that's now approximately 20 to 22 hours a week in average.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, I could normally do like, let's say around 6-7 hours of intensity a week.
Hmm.
So more than around 30 to 35%.
Yeah. So that's a little bit
Uh,
more than maybe like the Norwegian method that we're hearing a lot about, right? Like, because at least my impression is that that might be closer to like that we have 80 to 85% of everything at a low intensity.
yeah.
And yeah,
And
do you
I
think that
think if you're able to do 30 hours a week, every week, you cannot have that high percentage of high intensity, because the load would be too high. Uh, but for me, I'm not able to do 30 hours a week anymore, except from when I'm on camp and have a bit less work.
Mhm.
Uh, so that's why I'm doing a bit more intensity instead, to to keep the intensity and volume high enough, to keep the load high enough to develop.
And then back to like the lactate intensity that you're at on your high intensity workouts. I'm sure there are some workouts or sessions where you have higher lactate, but I talked to Blummenfelt and he told me about his values and I was kind of shocked. Even though I knew that he was low, he actually told me that on some trainings, if he's had like a lot of training the last couple of weeks, he could potentially be at 1.8 during his threshold trainings and still feel like he was putting in a lot of effort. I guess he's pretty tired if he's at 1.8 at threshold, but where do you usually where are you
That,
at on
that's
that?
that's funny, because I see a lot of people training with lactate monitors, and they've seen the Ingebrigt's runners doing
Mm,
threshold training and measuring 2.5 in lactate. So they're like, okay, my threshold is 2.5 in lactate.
yeah.
Uh, and they've never done a test to see what it actually is. So I think a lot of age group athletes, they have a lot higher threshold lactate. So in doing intervals at 2.5, that's really really easy for them.
Hmm.
Uh, but as you say, it depends on the load, and it depends on a lot of things. We've seen from the tests that I've done, that my threshold uh, is closer to 3.5. Normally, my lactate threshold is around 3.2 to 3.4. When I do a lot more hours and low intensity, it's closer to 3. But if I'm measuring 2.5, I'm below threshold. So there is an individual difference there.
How do you monitor so because I would think that it's easy to think that if you've done a test, even if you've done a test and you've seen that okay, my threshold is at 3.5, and then you have more training than you've had, like say you have 2 weeks of more training than you had previously, and so then your threshold might be at 3. But how do you know, like personally, how do you know that okay, now 3 is good enough?
That's a good question. I think first of all, you need to test often, because as you say, one test is not enough to see the whole picture. So normally we do tests during winter, during the summer and race season, pre-season and off-season, and we get a bigger picture on how we respond and how the intensity is throughout the year. Uh, but also lactate is it's just one part of intensity control. Uh, Normally we use lactate monitors on threshold intervals, uh, but we also use heart rate monitors. Uh, Uh, and I think the biggest and most important is the feeling you have,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to know your body. I see a lot of people, they do lactate measurements, and they see a number, and then they either go faster or they go slower according to the number, but they don't really control it towards the inner feeling, how hard it felt.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I think that's something you have to build over time with sessions. For example, say threshold, that's an intensity you should be able to keep for around an hour.
Yeah.
Uh, so even if you're measuring low lactate and you're not even able to push more than 30 minutes on that session, there's something wrong there.
Yeah.
So you need to control it with also the heart rate and the feeling, because you can have measurements that's wrong because of sweat and other things coming into the blood.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Caffeine uh, can make the lactate higher. Drinking orange juice can change the lactate. So there's really a lot of things. If you're uh, depleted from glycogen, you will normally have lower lactate. So just looking at the lactate on interval sessions is not good enough. You need to control it with heart rate and feeling and more monitors.
Yeah, because I feel like, and I guess most of us, we grow up, and then the first like monitoring that we're doing will be the heart rate, right? Like that's what you'll start out with, and we're talking about lactate, but it's pretty expensive to for like if you were a young kid wanting to do this, like you shouldn't get a lactate measure immediately because first of all it's expensive, and I think that you can get very far with just doing the or looking at your heart rate. And personally, and I feel like because you like what you're saying now about you shouldn't look too much at the lactate, I feel like maybe sometimes I've been a bit too proud of being able to have say a 2.5 lactate on my sessions and be like, oh, that's pretty good, and that was a high pace. um, but what I usually do is one thing is the pace, but I'm trying to look at my heart rate, and I know where when I can be at a higher heart rate and have a pretty low lactate and not feel bad. So like if you see those three combined, then I feel like it's pretty good. Because as a skater, it was almost the opposite, where I might have felt good, or sometimes I felt good, sometimes I felt bad. I had no idea. I was never able to guess my lactate, right? And I remember being told that the best athletes they would be able to actually guess their lactate at least a lot of the low intensity trainings that you could as a skater you would be like, I'm guessing that I have 1.5 and it's like 1.4 or maybe it was even 1.5. But now that I'm running, what I've seen that I've improved the most on is that at a higher heart rate, I'm able to still keep the lactate low. Because as a skater, the lactate would just be blown out of proportions, kind of, because we would have so much lactate when whether that was competing or even the easy skating, it was easy to kind of get higher. But is that something that you also look at? That okay, now I was able to have say 2 or 3 heartbeats higher, and the lactate is still low. Is that something that you look at as proof of improvement, or yeah?
Yeah, well, we always use more monitors, as you say. I think heart rate is the best and easiest one to use, and controlling that with lactate also, and also the feeling, and to look at it up against the pace, or the, the speed you're holding on the run, or the what you're holding on the bike. Uh, just to be able to control it and see the development. Uh, if you're going faster and the lactate is getting lower, of course, it's a good sign. Um, but I also think that to what you said, like the heart rate, it to use the heart rate as an example, it's easy to see that in the wrong sentence as well, because sometimes you can have a higher heart rate at a lower pace, and it doesn't really have to mean that you need to slow down.
Yeah.
Uh, if you've had some easy days, if you've been sick, your heart rate can normally be a bit higher.
Mm.
Uh, for me, when I have a lot of training, my heart rate is normally a bit lower. Uh, so being able to have a range in the heart rate zones, not to say that my heart rate at threshold is 180,
Mm.
I think is really important, because your your lactate at threshold and your heart rate at threshold, it's never 2.5 and
Yeah.
180. Uh, it's a range between, for example, 2.5 and 3, and 180 and 185. And it
Mm.
depends on the day, what you've been eating, have you been sleeping, and everything. So I see a lot of people that, if we say running for an example, they have a threshold pace around 320. So they go off in 320 pace in every interval session around threshold.
Mm.
And if you're having a bad day, you're maybe a bit more fatigued than you should be. Uh, maybe 320 is too high that day.
Mm.
So seeing that threshold is a range, and maybe starting off at 325 uh,
Yeah.
and progressing into the interval, I think that's really important, both for intensity control, but also consistency in the training.
Yeah. No, that's actually super interesting, and I think that that's one thing that I've learned much more. I feel like after I started running than I did before, because it's just been so obvious when you're competing at for such a long time. So during my or the only marathon that I did, then I remember, like you said, you have to go by the feeling. I could really tell like one or two heartbeats higher was like, and that had nothing to do with what I knew beforehand. Like I obviously knew where I was ish, but I remember when I hit 167 in the early stages of the marathon, I was like, okay, I can't. This is not okay. I can't. I have to go down on intensity. But then at 165, then I felt super good. I didn't feel like it was even uncomfortable. So like that difference of two heartbeats uh, was just the feeling that I had. It was so different. And I guess it's like what you're saying, that range, even though that range is pretty small with two heartbeats for difference, but it's still, I guess that's what we call the red zone, where you can easily get into that, and then you might have messed it all up on such a long distance, because it's harder to get back into that if you stay there for too long.
It definitely is. And I think that's where the importance of specific sessions comes in. Uh, of course, training for a marathon, you can't do all the sessions at target pace, but uh, I think all people racing, or mostly all people racing marathon or other road running races, they have a target time they want to be able to reach,
Hmm.
and then they have to have some sessions around that target time, uh, to see if it's the time that they can be able to reach. uh, and doing intervals at that pace, you get familiar with your heart rate around that pace. And doing longer intervals, you get to see if it's a heart rate that's sustainable or if it goes higher and higher towards the end of the interval at that pace. So, for example, if you're running marathon and your goal is to run 4 minutes per k, and you're doing say 4 times 15 minutes at that pace, uh, and your heart rate is going through the roof on the second interval, I think that's a clear sign that it's not sustainable for a marathon.
Mm.
So, but if you're able to keep a steady heart rate during that pace, then it's maybe time to focus more on the durability and
Yeah.
keeping that pace for longer.
I'm curious because when you're talking about this, I've been doing a lot of 10 times 1,000 meters, like as a part of my threshold training. It's been kind of my go-to, um, and on those, I've been so my like last time I had an average pace of 4:02, and I've been now trying to target. So lately, I kind of realized that okay, if I can do the same like in Boston, that would be amazing. And so if my target pace is 4:02 for Boston, then I would do say 350 to 355 on the 1,000 meters just to get a little bit higher speed pace on those. And then when I'm doing the longer workouts, then I'm obviously not doing 350 to 355. But what is your take on that? Do you think it's smart to go a little bit harder if you have shorter uh, intervals, or do you think that you should still stick to the target pace?
I think you need to go harder on the short intervals because uh, yeah, say if you're training at 10 times 1K session, that's very familiar in the running community. Uh, if you're doing that at your target marathon pace, the intensity would be too low to have any
Hmm.
benefits from the session. Because marathon is an intensity you should be able to keep for at least 2 hours.
Yeah.
If you're running really fast.
Yeah, if you're running
Uh,
really fast, yeah.
and and if you see the runners that's running really fast and close to 2 hours, uh, their marathon pace is closer to the threshold. Uh,
Yeah.
but if you're a guy or a woman running 4 hours on the marathon, your threshold pace would probably be a lot faster than your marathon pace.
Hmm.
Uh, so I think if you're having shorter intervals, you need to do them faster. If I do threshold intervals, I normally go quite much faster than on the marathon intervals.
Hmm.
But I also see that my threshold is closer to my marathon pace now than it was
Yeah.
a few years ago. So it all depends on what you're training for and the training you're doing.
Yeah, because this leads me into a question that I'm very curious to ask you. And I guess like back to the lactate, the heart rate, all of it. I feel very much the same way as you say that what my threshold is, I can probably do for almost 3 hours, like for the marathon, and like obviously it will be harder at the end. But I do see that for myself. Um, I'm I've been surprised by how long I can actually keep that intensity, and it's probably a little bit under threshold, but I do feel like it is, like at least based on tests that I've done previously. But my experience and what I've told people, it's kind of become like something that I repeat all the time, is that the marathon is not really painful for most of it. Like it starts being a little bit okay. This is almost comfortable. I just have to hold back, and then again into this like okay, now I have to start working a little bit more, but it's still not bad. It's maybe a little bit uncomfortable, and then it becomes uncomfortable, and then I suffer for the last say 10 to 12 kilometers. Uh, what is your experience with this?
Yeah, it's funny because the three marathons I've done have all been different. When I did the first in Valencia in 23, it was painful pretty early uh, because I went out too hard the first half.
Hmm.
Uh, my splits were 110 and 119 for the half
Okay, yeah.
marathons.
Hmm.
So I think you can say, according to that, it was a painful last half.
Yes.
I went out way too fast on the first half marathon and started to struggle after 23, 24 kilometers. Um, and on my second marathon at DSM last year, it wasn't a race for me. It was a long and hard training session
Hmm.
towards Valencia. So
Hmm.
I ran quite controlled the whole way, and it was never really painful. It was uncomfortable few parts of the race, but never really suffering. And I kept the steady pace the whole way. And in Valencia, where I have my PP from last year, uh, I started to struggle around 33, 34K. So just around the 35K mark. That's, I think, famous for hitting the
Hmm.
wall in the marathon. Uh, but I think that if you're running a marathon and you're starting to struggle before halfway, then you're running too fast. A marathon should be not easy, but it should be uh, uncomfortable for the first, I'd say at least 25Ks, maybe up to 30K,
Hmm.
to be able to keep the whole way.
Yeah.
And same with half marathon. The best half marathons I've done have been quite comfortable for the first 10, 12, and up to 15K.
Hmm.
And then
And
for
then
the
it
last
starts.
six, it's really suffering.
Yeah.
So it's different
That's
from running a 3K. Of course, it's never hard the first 500 meters on a 3K either. But you start struggling earlier on in the shorter races.
yeah, because that was in the last episode of this podcast. I was talking about expectations versus reality of the marathon, and my expectation before, like when I started training for my first marathon, was that I I was thinking of it as the 10K, where I've done some 10Ks, and I know that I suffer for a fairly long time. And I kind of imagined myself going out for the marathon and being like, I'm going to be exhausted like that from the very first kilometer. And then pretty early on realized that that's not how the marathon works. Like, you the work we're putting in, at least this is my take on it, is that the work we're putting in is mostly almost to kind of help us to get an easy journey for the first, like you said, 25, 30, maybe even 35 kilometers, and then try to take advantage of all the training again when you have 10, 7 to 10 kilometers left.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And that was the biggest difference for me going from biathlon to triathlon. Uh, because in biathlon you could suffer really early on because
Hmm.
you got all the short breaks, and it was a lot of lactate. Uh, Uh, and in full distance racing and in marathon racing, it's not really suffering in the same way. You're never far over your lactate threshold. Um, you're keeping a controlled pace, but uh, it should also be that high and that hard that you're really suffering for the last, say, the last 15 to 25% of the race.
Mm.
But since the race is so long, it's a different suffering. You're not
Yeah.
feeling the lactate pumping to your ears, but it's more of a muscular and mental battle, I'd say. Uh, yeah, I feel it's easier in the longer races to have a lot of bounce during the race. The mental game is much harder because you start suffering and your body is telling you that you need to stop and that this is going too slow and you're good enough.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it can come a period that's quite good again, where you're feeling strong and feeling good. Uh, and then you have another, call it breakdown,
Mm.
throughout the race. But in the shorter races, it's hard. But when it gets hard, it never gets easy.
No,
But
exactly.
it's for a lot shorter time.
But you said you had three very different experiences, and obviously one where you opened way too hard. And but then in my like the way I look at it, because I remember following you through these two marathons that you did back to back. What how long was it? Like a couple of weeks between
Three
the winter
three
marathon?
weeks between
Three
Jessheim
weeks.
and Valencia. Uh,
Yeah. And so the first one that you did in Jessheim, which is like in Norway in November, it was a pretty cold day, right? It wasn't.
yeah, it wasn't snowy, but it was around 3-4 degrees, I think.
Yeah, and so like knowing the physics of cold air being thicker than hot air, and probably just like I think I remember seeing you wearing more clothes, like you know things that play a role into to running and things you could argue that would make you faster or slower. I would almost say that I think that your Yesay marathon then was maybe better, even though it was a couple of minutes slower than the Valencia one. What do you think?
Yeah, I see why you're saying it, and I think I can. Well, it's hard to say I can agree, but because we'll never know how fast I could have run.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take all those things into consideration, bit more clothing, um, a bit thicker air. Also, I was running the race alone. In
Mm-hmm.
Valencia, I had thousands of people around me, making it easier. Um, so, of course, I could have run minutes faster. But how much faster? It's really hard to say. But there's no doubt that that session leading into Valencia was was not 100% ideal. Uh, I would have needed at least one more week going into Valencia to have that session.
Yeah.
Um, so you can say to be at my A game 100% in Valencia, I think I would have had to either do it a bit slower, shorten it down, or have a bit time between the races.
Mm-hmm.
Because even though I felt good in Valencia and had a good race, it had quite big impact on the training I could do the 2 weeks after ESM. And I lost a few important sessions towards Valencia.
Yeah.
But it's always hard to say what benefits the most. Of course, it was a good session, a specific session. I got to train on nutrition
Mm-hmm.
and everything specific towards the marathon. But it always costs a lot to race a marathon, although you're not racing it all out.
Mm-hmm. But I would still say maybe like regardless of if whether it's smart or not, like that could always be argued. But still, like in terms of performance, doing because you did 2:25 in Yesheim, right?
No,
And
228.
2:28. Okay, yeah. So
Yeah.
then it was a faster one in Valencia then. I
Yeah.
thought you said 2:25 because then I was like then that would have been a better marathon than 2:23 in Valencia, like just time wise.
I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. Well, very short. We're running out of time here, but like very short on the how do you control the intensity during the marathon? Like, do you use your heart rate monitor and use that at all, or do you just run by feeling?
I use heart rate, feeling, pace.
Yeah.
Of course, I have a target pace going into the marathon, which I've been trained for. Uh, but I also have a range of the heart rate that I'm controlling, and I control that against the feeling I have. If the heart rate is a bit higher than it should be, but the feeling is good, it feels super easy. Uh, I don't necessarily bother about it, but
No.
if it's feeling a bit too hard, and the heart rate is also a bit higher, I'm adjusting the pace. Uh, so it's always a balance between the feeling and the heart rate and mm, all the monitors that you're using,
Yeah.
because you can have a good feeling for the first 10K, but if you were running the first 10K a bit too hard, then the feeling will bite back out in the race. But if you're if you're running way too fast in the beginning and it's still feeling good and easy, your heart rate will most likely be higher. So then you need to, if that's why I'm using this range in heart rate. For
Mm-hmm.
example, in my last marathons, I've been averaging around 175 in heart rate.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite close to my threshold.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that if I'm running at my threshold heart rate early on in the marathon, even though it's feeling easy, I need to slow down.
Yeah.
But normally, if you're running at your threshold heart rate early in the race, your pace would also be faster than your target marathon
Yeah.
pace
Yeah.
if you've done the
Yeah.
specific sessions.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a bunch of monitors that you use to control everything. But I
Yeah.
think heart rate and feeling is the most important.
Cool. That and then we have the at least to me the most scary part of the marathon, and that is nutrition and like keeping everything under control there. I know that. So we met work. I was working for Fuel of Norway, and or like I was making some videos for them, and I know that you've been sponsored or worked with them for 6 years, five or 6 years already.
Yeah, since I started doing triathlon,
Mm-hmm.
so it's 7 years now.
Wow. And how I guess like since you started triathlon, and so I can say like how that has changed your career as a triathlete, because you probably then only used them for that, but I know that you also been a part of like developing some of their product, giving them feedback. Can you tell us a little bit about Fuel of Norway? What is it? What is the benefit of using Fuel of Norway to you compared to other products? And also like a little bit of how you're using that during, say, your marathon.
Yeah. Of course, in triathlon and when you're training a lot, nutrition is key. And in the long races, you need a lot of carbohydrates. Um, and Fuel Norway it's a Norwegian brand making sports nutrition. And I've been lucky enough to have them as a sponsor for the last 7 years, uh, and being able to develop some of their products, especially the ones with caffeine. Um, and I think that nutrition it's the same as with the other training you're doing. You need to practice it
Mm.
because, of course, normally you never eat gels and drink sports drink during the day if you're not training. So thinking that you can come to a race eating gels and drinking sports drink without having tried it, mm, it's not a good idea. And also ingesting drinks, food during higher intensity, it's a lot of stress on the stomach and your system. So it's something you need to practice. Uh, and triathletes is known for their intense focus on nutrition during training and racing. And they've been pushing the boundaries a lot with how many grams of carbs you can ingest during 1 hour of racing. It's not many years since people thought that 60 grams per hour was the maximum you could ingest. But now people are pushing 140 grams. People are even pushing up to 200, 220 grams per hour. Although I don't think that's beneficial, but studies have shown that if you train for it, your body can be able to take up to 140 grams of carbohydrates per hour, and that's a lot of sugar for the body and your system to be able to digest. So it's something you need to train for during specific sessions. And I use a lot of gels, a lot of sports drink during my high intensity sessions, uh, training specific for racing by fueling with 120 to 140 grams per hour. Uh, and also using caffeine as a boost during race. Uh, I find that beneficial, and studies have also shown that caffeine is uh, something that can make you push harder during a race.
Do you then use, like, say, caffeine for, now that you're doing the Rotterdam? Will you use caffeine for the whole, caffeine gels for the whole marathon, or will you use it more towards the end?
Normally, I use caffeine before races and during races. But what's important to know is that uh, you don't get the effect from caffeine right after you ingest it. Normally, it takes between 45 to 60 minutes before it starts to work. So,
Mhm.
if you're running a 3 hour marathon and you're taking caffeine for the last 30 minutes, you won't really have the benefit from it.
Mm.
And also, caffeine, it takes 4 to 5 hours to reduce the amount of caffeine you have in your body by 50%. So
Mhm.
it's better to take it a bit earlier than a bit too late.
Yeah.
Uh, but normally I use 1 to 2 higher doses before and during races because you need at least 3 grams of caffeine per kilo body weight. Some people need up to 6 grams per body weight. So it's quite a high dose. When people say that they have a cup of coffee and they can really feel it, it's not necessarily from the caffeine. It's more the placebo
Mm-hmm.
because you need a quite huge dose. That's what we started developing in Fuel Norway, gels with high doses of caffeine, because we saw that the ones that were on the market, they had between 25 and 45 grams milligrams of caffeine in one gel, meaning that you would have to take at least 6 or more gels to get
Mm-hmm.
benefits from the caffeine.
What would you say that? Because at least for me personally, what I like about Fuel of Norway is that my stomach tends to be a bit sensitive when I'm doing high intensity training. I guess like that's the same for a lot of us, but I feel like mine might be a bit more sensitive than others. And what I loved about Fuel of Norway was that it felt like my body handled that better. That was my impression. What do you feel like is the biggest benefit for you with Fuel?
I agree with what you're saying. I've never had stomach issues with Fuel Norway, and I think that has to do a lot with their flavors and that it's naturally flavored. Um, and it's pH neutral as well. Uh, and also they have a huge range in tastes,
Mm-hmm.
which make it easier to take on more, uh, especially during the longer Ironman races. Racing
Yeah.
for 8 hours, you will get sick and tired of eating sugar all day, and you will
Yeah.
have trouble on the run to get in enough. So having a brand that has a lot of different tastes makes it easier to take on the amount you need during all race.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest advantage, and also the amount of salt, natrium they have in their drink uh, makes it beneficial during especially summer races, but also for say high sweaters. I normally sweat a lot during high intensity.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen on heat sessions that in a normal summer day, I can sweat up to 2.3 liters per hour.
Wow.
So having sports drink with the right amount of natrium uh, makes it easier to get in for the body to keep the water that you're getting in, more beneficial in the heat.
How will you solve that during the Rotterdam of like get because I assume that you'll be obviously fueling with Fuel of Norway during the marathon. I see it as a big issue for me at the Boston that I'm obviously not one of the fastest ones, so I will just have to use the stations that they have there. That will be a different brand, and so like having all the gels with me, I don't feel like it's an option. How will you solve that with drinks and gels during the marathon?
It's true what you say that if you're not an elite runner in marathon, you have to be able to bring what you need or to take on what they have on the stations.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, on every stations they normally have water at least. So what I tend to do is bringing all the gels I need from the start, and also start with a little bottle of sports drink that I take on for the first 5K, before I just throw it. And then I have gels for the rest of the race in the running belts or in some pockets. And I tend to take them at every aid station together with some water.
Yeah.
Because gels are quite concentrated, so it's easier to get stomach issues if you have a lot of gels and no fluid as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So knowing that I have the right amount of carbohydrates in gels for the whole race from the start, I just have to make sure I get in the right amount of fluid during the aid stations for the race.
Cool. And how many will you be taking during the marathon? Gels?
6 gels. I
6
used the
gels.
fuel loaded gel that has 40 grams of carbohydrates per gel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that will give me 240 grams of carbohydrates, which will be enough for at least 2 hours. And with the sports drink mix I will have from the start, I will
Wow.
definitely have enough energy for the whole race if I'm racing at the time I'm trying to target.
So how do you do that then? Do you have already a plan for when during the race, like the first one at X kilometers and so on and so on?
Yeah, I tend to keep it quite simple. Normally, I take a gel every 20 minutes, and if you
Okay.
take
Yeah.
40 grams every 20 minutes, you have 120 gram for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
So I would normally start the sports drink mix containing 40 grams for the first 20 minutes, and then a gel every 20 minutes afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then you have 120 grams an hour.
Cool. And last question on this nutrition thing, and then we're gonna finish this off. But do you? So there's like bicarb has now become like more of a thing, and then you have creatine that is also like that is not creatine not for the races, but like it's become very popular amongst runners and endurance athletes just to get more energy and better recovery. What is your take on those two?
Never tried it myself. Um, I've heard so many episodes of people having stomach issues with bicarb,
Mm-hmm.
especially during races. It seems to work fine for them during intervals where you have breaks for the stomach to ease down. But during races where, especially running, where you're jumping up and down, uh,
Mm-hmm.
I've seen so many episodes of people having stomach issues using bicarb. Uh, and also bicarb, I think it's more beneficial if you're racing shorter distance.
Yeah.
In the marathon, your lactate levels will never be that high. Um, so yeah, not something I've tried and think I will try uh,
Yeah.
in the near future. But creatine is I haven't tried it, but I'm really curious about it. I have some friends using it, saying they benefit from it. Um, but I haven't tried it, so I can't say much about it yet.
No. Well, I'm very grateful for having you on here, and it's been very interesting. I've definitely learned some more things myself, and just to finish it off, if you have one advice for, obviously this is a marathon podcast, so if we keep it to for runners, what is your advice for runners, regardless of their level or age? To kind of improve and reach their goals.
Oh, that's a good one. I could say so many things, but I would say consistency. Uh, for runners, there's not many sports that have a high risk of injury, seeing the impact that running and jumping up and down has on your bones. So think a bit longer than the next day and the next week, and be consistent in your training. Don't push it just to have one great session or one great race. See it at a bigger picture, and I think you will benefit from a bigger development if you manage to do that. Um, and also find the races and the distances that you like and train specific towards them, in terms of interval times, intensity, nutrition, and everything around. I think that would have to be my best advice.
Nice. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks for
Well,
having me
Kristian,
on.
yeah, thank you so much. I think that everyone listening to this will learn a lot, and I'm sure that they will be better athletes for it. So thank you.
I hope so. Thanks.
I have so much respect for Kristian combining his career with a full-time job on the side. I'm really excited to see what he can do at the Rotterdam Marathon. We'll obviously do a little bit of an update on his performances there next week. But thanks for listening. I hope you got as much out of this as I did. See you in the next one.
You're listening to the Marathon Podcast, brought to you by Wild Studio.